It cuts through the smoke-filled back room, louder than it needs to be, lingering just long enough to sting. Men pause mid-drink. Cards stop moving across the table. Everyone understands what is happening, and who it is meant for. At the far end of the room stands Al Capone, younger than the man history will remember, broader than most men in the city, and still learning the difference between power and restraint. His jaw tightens. His hands stay still. For now. Humiliation is not accidental in this world. It is a message, a test, a provocation designed to force a reaction, preferably a violent one. And the rival gang delivering it knows exactly what they're doing. They don't challenge Capone with guns. They don't threaten his territory. They laugh at him. A comment is made. Then another. Something about his accent. Something about his temper. Something said just loudly enough for the room to hear, but softly enough to deny if confronted. The insult spreads like a stain. Capone feels the pull immediately. The instinct to respond. To remind everyone who he is. Violence would be easy. Expected. Almost welcomed. That's the trap. Because this isn't about pride. It's about reputation. In Chicago's underworld, a man who allows himself to be humiliated becomes smaller than the rumor that follows him. But a man who reacts too fast becomes predictable. And predictability gets men killed. Capone shifts his weight. His eyes scan the room. He notices who is watching, who is smiling, who is silent. Silence, sometimes, is worse than laughter. Then, movement. A chair scrapes slowly across the floor. Not abrupt. Not aggressive. Intentional. From the shadows steps Johnny Torrio. Older, calmer, immaculately dressed. His presence alone alters the temperature of the room. Torrio doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't look at the men laughing. He looks at Capone. And in that look is a warning, not of danger, but of consequence. Torrio understands something Capone is still learning. Humiliation is a weapon meant to be returned with interest, but only when the timing guarantees profit. Not relief. Not revenge. Profit. The laughter fades, unsure of itself now. The rival gang senses the shift, but too late to reclaim control. They wanted spectacle. They wanted Capone to explode. Instead, they've drawn Torrio into the moment. And Torrio never steps in unless the situation matters. Because what happens next will not just decide how Capone responds, it will decide what kind of man he becomes. A blunt instrument, or something far more dangerous. This is not the story of a gunfight. It's the story of restraint, of humiliation redirected, of a single intervention that will echo through Chicago's criminal hierarchy. Capone is being tested, not by his enemies, but by the man who made him. And the lesson Torrio is about to teach will define everything that follows. To understand why that moment of laughter was dangerous, you have to understand the Chicago Al Capone stepped into, and the man who taught him how to survive it. Before Prohibition turned liquor into gold, Chicago's underworld was already crowded with egos, grudges, and unfinished business. Power wasn't centralized. It was negotiated daily, often violently, between ethnic crews, neighborhood gangs, and political fixers who blurred the line between crime and governance. At the center of this fragile balance stood Johnny Torrio. Torrio was not feared because he was loud. He was feared because he was final. Where others chased dominance through intimidation, Torrio chased control through structure. He believed crime should resemble business, efficient, predictable, and disciplined. Violence was a tool of last resort, not a reflex. When Torrio brought Al Capone from New York to Chicago years earlier, it wasn't because Capone was refined. It was because he was useful. Capone had muscle, loyalty, and an instinct for opportunity. What he lacked was patience. And patience, in Chicago, was survival. The rival gang in that smoke-filled room understood this dynamic perfectly. Their attempt to humiliate Capone was not personal. It was strategic. They wanted to provoke him into overreacting, to paint him as uncontrollable, to force Torrio's hand. Because if Capone became a liability, Torrio would have to choose. And if Torrio chose stability over sentiment, Capone would be isolated. That was the real gamble. Humiliation, in this world, was not about embarrassment. It was about hierarchy. A public insult left unanswered suggested weakness. An overreaction suggested recklessness. Either outcome could fracture alliances and invite encroachment. The room itself reflected the tension of the era. Men who smiled one moment carried grudges the next. Conversations were layered. What was said, what was implied, and what was meant for someone else to overhear. Torrio read all of it. He saw how the laughter wasn't universal. Some men watched Capone closely, measuring his reaction. Others watched Torrio, waiting to see whether the older boss would intervene, or let his protégé fail publicly. Because that choice would signal something larger, whether Torrio still controlled his house. And Torrio's control mattered beyond that room. At this point in history, Chicago's criminal economy was on the edge of transformation. Prohibition loomed. Alcohol would soon reshape everything: supply routes, enforcement, profits, and violence. Whoever entered that era divided would be consumed by it. Torrio knew that discipline now meant dominance later. That is why he stepped forward, not to defend Capone's pride, but to prevent a narrative from forming. A narrative where Capone was reactive, where Torrio's organization lacked internal order. The rival gang had tried to weaponize mockery. Instead, they had forced Torrio to demonstrate authority. And authority, when displayed calmly, is far more intimidating than rage. The tension in the room sharpened. No one laughed anymore. No one spoke. The moment stretched, heavy with expectation. Because everyone sensed it, this was no longer about a joke or an insult. It was about whether Al Capone would learn when to strike, and when to wait. And Johnny Torrio was about to make sure that lesson landed. Johnny Torrio does not raise his voice. That is the first mistake the room makes, assuming nothing is happening. He pulls a chair back with measured care and sits, not between Capone and the laughter, but slightly to the side. It's a subtle repositioning, one that changes nothing physically and everything psychologically. He places his hat on the table, smooths the brim. Only then does he speak. Not to the men who laughed, to the room itself. Torrio talks about business, about supply delays, about the cost of unnecessary attention. His tone is calm, almost conversational. The insult hangs in the air, unanswered, growing uncomfortable by the second. This is intentional. Humiliation only works if it's acknowledged. Torrio refuses to grant it that oxygen. Al Capone remains standing. He understands now, or begins to. Torrio is not stopping him from responding. He is teaching him how not to. Every instinct in Capone demands reaction. The rival gang watches him closely, expecting a flare of temper, a step forward, something they can point to later and say, "See? He's unstable." But Torrio has reframed the moment. By ignoring the insult publicly, he has turned it into an embarrassment for the men who delivered it. Their laughter now looks childish, forced, out of place. Cause becomes consequence. One of the rival men shifts in his seat. Another clears his throat, as if considering whether to speak, and decides against it. The balance has already moved. Then Torrio does something unexpected. He praises them. He compliments their operation, their efficiency, their ambition. He acknowledges their presence as if they were equals, but not quite. There's a faint distance in his words, the kind that suggests seniority without ever claiming it outright. It's a masterclass in dominance. Capone watches closely. This is not submission. This is containment. By refusing to confront the insult, Torrio forces the rival gang to either escalate, which would make them the aggressors, or retreat quietly, which makes them look weak. Either choice favors Torrio. Minutes pass. Drinks are finished. Conversations resume, but they are thinner now, careful. The insult is never repeated. When the meeting finally breaks, Torrio stands and gestures for Capone to follow him. No lecture, no reprimand, just movement. In the hallway, away from ears, Torrio stops. He looks at Capone, really looks at him. "You felt it," Torrio says quietly. "It's not a question." Capone nods. "That's good," Torrio replies. "Feeling it means you care. Acting on it too fast means they control you." Capone says nothing. He doesn't need to. The lesson is already landing. Torrio explains what almost happened. How humiliation was used to bait violence. How one outburst would have justified retaliation. How retaliation would have fractured alliances just as the city was about to become more profitable and more dangerous than ever before. Power, Torrio tells him, isn't proving you're dangerous. It's deciding when other people aren't worth the effort. That night changes Capone's trajectory. Not immediately, not completely, but something hardens into focus. He begins to understand that reputation is not built on fear alone, but on predictability, on restraint, on making enemies unsure whether provoking you will achieve anything at all. The rival gang leaves believing they failed, but not fully understanding why. And Capone leaves knowing something else, that violence denied can be more humiliating than violence delivered. Johnny Torrio didn't save Capone's pride that night. He redirected it. And in doing so, he turned a moment of potential weakness into a quiet escalation, one that would echo the next time Chicago's underworld tested where Al Capone truly stood. Because next time, Torrio might not be there to step in. The mistake is thinking that humiliation ends when the room empties. It doesn't. It lingers. It travels. It mutates into rumor. The rival gang does not repeat the joke openly again, but they don't have to. In Chicago, implication spreads faster than confession. A raised eyebrow, a half-told story, a suggestion that Al Capone hesitated when tested, and hesitation, no matter how strategic, attracts predators. Within weeks, the environment tightens. Meetings grow colder. Negotiations stall. Small challenges appear at the edges of Capone's territory, deliveries delayed, messengers disrespected, favors returned late. None of it is overt. All of it is deliberate. This is escalation by erosion. Johnny Torrio sees it immediately. He understands that restraint without follow-up is misunderstood as weakness. The earlier intervention worked, but only halfway. Now the narrative must be corrected, not emotionally, but structurally. Torrio does not confront the rival gang. He isolates them. Supply lines shift. Access narrows. Introductions that once came easily now require effort, and often fail. Men who once laughed find themselves excluded from rooms that suddenly matter. Not punished. Ignored. The effect is slow, but unmistakable. At the same time, Torrio changes Capone's role. He places him visibly, deliberately, in negotiations that matter. Not as muscle, as authority. Capone is made the final voice in discussions where calm is required. The message is precise. This is not a man who reacts. This is a man who decides. Capone feels the weight of it. This is no longer about pride. It is about responsibility, about understanding that every reaction teaches people how to use you. Then comes the moment that locks the lesson in place. An assassination attempt nearly kills Torrio. Bullets tear through his car. Blood spills. The city holds its breath. Torrio survives. Barely. And survival clarifies everything. From his hospital bed, Torrio makes a decision that shocks many and confuses even more. He steps back. Not because he is weak, but because he knows when to exit the stage. Power transfers quietly, and suddenly, Capone is no longer the student being protected. He is the structure being tested. The rival gang watches closely. So does everyone else. Capone does not retaliate wildly. He does not overcorrect. He applies what Torrio taught him, selectively, decisively. When force is used, it is final. When silence is chosen, it is intentional. The humiliation from that earlier night is erased, not by vengeance, but by outcome. Capone is no longer the man who almost reacted. He is the man people now hesitate to provoke. Johnny Torrio's single intervention did not just save Capone from a bad decision. It prepared him for a moment when restraint would no longer be optional, and when leadership would demand something more dangerous than rage. It would demand judgment. And judgment, once tested under pressure, changes a man permanently. Years later, when people try to explain Al Capone, they almost always reach for the same words: violent, reckless, unstoppable. It's a convenient version of the story. Loud, simple, wrong. Because the man Capone became was shaped as much by what he didn't do as by what he did. That night of attempted humiliation never made the newspapers. No bodies marked the moment. No shots were fired. And yet, it quietly altered the trajectory of Chicago's underworld, and Capone's place within it. What Johnny Torrio understood, and what he forced Capone to understand, was that power matures in stages. First, it demands strength. Then, it demands restraint. And finally, it demands judgment, the most dangerous requirement of all. Capone would go on to make choices Torrio might never have approved of. He would embrace visibility when Torrio preferred silence. He would become a symbol when Torrio believed symbols were liabilities. Their philosophies would diverge. But that lesson endured. When Capone later consolidated power, he did not respond to every insult. He did not fight every rival. Some men were crushed quickly. Others were simply erased from relevance. And many were left untouched, not because Capone feared them, but because acknowledging them would give them exactly what they wanted. The rival gang that once tried to humiliate him learned that lesson too, not through confrontation, but through consequence. Influence dries up. Allies drift away. Opportunities disappear. In the underworld, irrelevance is a quieter death than violence, and often a more permanent one. Johnny Torrio's single intervention was not about defending Capone's ego. It was about teaching him how systems work. Once Torrio stepped aside, Capone inherited more than territory. He inherited a philosophy forged in moments like that one, moments where reaction would have felt good, but patience proved profitable. History remembers Capone as a force of chaos. But the truth is more unsettling. He was at his most dangerous when he learned to wait, because humiliation, when endured and redirected, becomes leverage. Silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes authority, and restraint, once mastered, becomes a weapon few recognize until it's too late. That rival gang thought they were exposing Al Capone. Instead, they helped finish his education. And in the world Johnny Torrio understood better than anyone, the most important lessons are taught quietly, in rooms where laughter stops, and no one dares to explain why.